It is another edition of the On the Mic podcast, and I think the first time in 3 years we've spoken over any type of interview, and first time face to face. So I'm super excited to welcome back and finally do a video interview with the one and only, one of the very best in any sport. She is so great at what she does. The one and only Laura Sanko. Laura, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate you having me. It has been a while since we've caught up. So no, I'm happy to do it. We got some good fights to talk about too.
We do, and there's a lot I want to talk to you about, and you're giving me some time, so I think I can squeeze it all in. I
All
want
right,
to
let's
get
go.
this out of the way though, because about a couple years ago, UFC 261 during the weigh-in show, I made a nice little tweet for your BMF list, which you credited me for, and then DC and Dean Thomas, who I spoke to after, buried me for it because they felt I was brown nosing. And I was just trying to show the world that you were kicking their ass. I mean, do you remember that?
I do vaguely, but I can't remember what the list was on.
Yeah, it was like top 5 BMF fighters in like all of the UFC. And I think you were the only one to include Amanda Nunes on your list. And
Sounds about right.
yeah, and then
About right.
you guys had like a putting challenge and you were doing it in heels. Like you were just
Oh yeah. Those were the days, man. I'll tell you what, that show gets me into all sorts of wild situations.
Well, that's one thing I wanted to talk to you about because, obviously you've done so much, especially this year. I think one thing that is severely underrated in what you do is just the length of that weigh-in show and how you're so, you and the team are so creative. Everybody from RJ Clifford to
Yeah.
Dan Kelly, like all of you guys do so much. How much fun is it to do a show like that, which is so different from calling fights or doing what you do backstage on Contender Series?
I love that show so much because it's well, for a lot of reasons, like just it feels like I'm just sitting around with a bunch of friends, kind of just talking. And that really is what it's meant to be. And you got to give a lot of credit to the producers though, because in terms of like the people who have a mind for, because you're right, it's a very long show. So the people who have the mind for how we're going to fill that all with meaningful and fun content and really engage people and keep them, listening for a full 3 hours plus, that credit really needs to go to the producers. I get to just show up and have fun and laugh with my friends. And, there's definitely some homework that goes into it, but a lot less than like calling fights or working the desk. So for me, it's one of my favorite things that I do. And in terms of like my career, it was the first time that the UFC tapped me as an analyst. Like I remember getting the call for the show and my boss was like, "Hey, we've got a new show that we're going to try out." And he kind of talked about the format. And immediately in my mind, I'm like, I'm trying really hard. Like, I really don't want to host anything. I want to host stuff. Like I like work. I like doing more, but like, I really, I was immediately feeling kind of conflicted about it. And then when he was like, "We're going to have you, Dan Halley's going to host it, and we're going to have you as one of the consistent analysts." Oh man, so happy. So happy.
As an analyst and as a professional broadcaster, can you kind of speak to the balance of, all right, we have to have fun, we have to be entertaining, but then there are times where we've got to address, hey, this fighter's not showing up, they're probably this weight. Also, we have to talk to these fighters 30 seconds after they step off a scale. I mean, that's a very hard balance. Can you kind of speak to how you do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that really just comes from all of us being really integrated in this sport and understanding what it's like to cut weight and, knowing how devastating it is, to have a fight fall off a card. So I think when your analysts are people who have, and obviously I'm not saying I experienced it at the UFC level, but I've had people not show up for fights. I've cut weight 8 times. Like I know what that feels like, even though it's been, a little while. I think when you understand what firsthand what the stakes are, it's easy to kind of like toggle back and forth between, hey, let's have some fun, and then be like, man, this is really, you feel for people in various situations when it's something that you've, kind of experienced to some degree in your life, for sure.
Probably a dumb question, but I'm going to ask for all the other fans out there. When do you know, and it's obviously a producer call more than anything, but when do you know, sitting in your seat, like, all right, we're probably not getting much out of this fighter. They just want to go rehydrate. Is it like after the first question?
Oh, always after the first question. And then it's like, oh, you feel terrible. And sometimes like the last show that I did wasn't the one in Abu Dhabi because I was at the ESPN desk for that. But the show before that, the Sydney show, we were having all sorts of technical difficulties, and there was just something about the fighters all had tough cuts. And so like, those were some of the worst interviews. I remember at one point, I think I was just like, you know what? I'm just gonna let you go. Cause we were having a hard time hearing each other. Like it's just not worth it. And that's kind of the nice thing about that show, to be honest with you, is like, it's so informal that, you know, I wasn't going to get in trouble for just being like, you know what, we're going to let you go. You know, it works out fine. And I think that I can't remember who it was that we let go, but like, I'm sure it might've even been Sean, but I think he really appreciated it because yeah, that was a rough one. You generally can tell as soon as they start talking, whether you're going to get a good interview or not.
Now, I want to make this clear. I mean, I've talked to you, off interview record and just told you how inspirational you are, how motivational you are to me.
Thank you.
One thing I really love about your work is you pull a lot from the person and not just the fighter. Now, when you're calling fights, you're doing a fantastic job. But for me, especially doing this podcast, I just want to give this podcast as a platform for fighters to come in and talk about who they are. Mm-hmm. And when you're doing Contender Series, and I promise this is a segue into 295. But when you're doing Contender Series, not only are you taking in these fighters' biggest moments of their careers, of their lives, you're able to mix it all in together. How much, I guess, pride do you take in being able to share both sides? Because I'll use a different example real quick. Like the NFL draft, they get kind of dragged through the mud every year because they're like, oh, here's a top 15 talent, and here's all this bad stuff he went through in his personal life. And it's like, are we here for football? Or are we here for their backstory? You do a great job mixing in both. So how much pride do you take in being able to tell their story and share their proudest moment with them?
Well, thank you for that. First of all, I appreciate that. And I would love to tell you that it is, sorry, my mother-in-law is calling me. I would love to tell you that it is, something that's overly intentional on my part. I really think it just comes from like my personality. I want to be sure and show every side of someone. I want people to know who you are as an athlete first and foremost. That's why we're here, especially on Contender Series. But I do think it's important to give the audience a reason to cheer for someone, a reason to identify with someone in that moment. So you do really have to strike a balance. But like in the interviews, the post-fight interviews and the contract winning interviews, it's really pretty easy for me to get wrapped up in the emotion. And when you see me getting emotional, it's a very real thing for me. And I for a while, it was kind of a running joke, like how many times this season is Laura going to cry? But the reason that happens to me is because I think that there's a big piece of me that lives vicariously through everyone on that show. Win, lose, draw, man, woman, speaks English, doesn't speak English. Like there's a piece of me that lives vicariously through what you're doing. So I really I become attached to the moment in a really big way. So I remember, I haven't gotten in a while, but I remember early on people were kind of insinuating that maybe I was, not being real with my emotions. Like, no, I really am that emotional. It's just,
it's okay. Because honestly, me too. Honestly, me too. But the thing is, when you pull it out of them, that's where I can admit on this podcast, because it's my podcast, that I get extremely emotional. Like when they're talking to you and they're just explaining how much the moment means to them, it's usually when I break, and there's some stories we had this year that are really daunting,
Every year, man. Every year there's just some crazy, crazy stories. And I think what's so special about that show and what differentiates it even from a pay-per-view or from a fight night is, I guess you get really huge moments in a pay-per-view, but there's so much going on with a pay-per-view that it's hard to really, unless you're doing the in-octagon interview. That's why there's so much good stuff that happens there. But it's really hard to have those moments any other time than right then. But on Contender Series, I always make the comparison. It's I feel sometimes like a labor and delivery nurse. I get to be there. It's not about me, but I get to be there when someone has one of the biggest, if not the biggest moment of their entire life. And I get to kind of participate and facilitate it. And man, it's hard not to get swept up into how big that moment really is for that person. It's different than it's your fourth fight in the UFC and you're up 2 and you're down 2 and you're not ranked yet. And good job. It was great. And I still, trust me, I still feel those interviews too. But it's just the meaning on Contender Series, the stakes in Contender Series could not be higher for a lot of these, for everyone.
Well, you probably talk to them more than pretty much 99% of the population. what is the difference in Dana White's kind of vision and attitude towards the Contender Series show? Like you said, because there's a big difference. Like, let's look at this weekend. This weekend we know he's going to be in the octagon following the two big fights. Then he's going to go answer questions, 20% of which are not going to be related to the event. 30% are going to be people trying to get him to badmouth other people, and then 50% may be about the event. But when he gets to hand these contracts off to people and say, "Hey, you're getting dragged back from the hospital because I'm giving you a contract," how much do you see Dana White taking in every single Tuesday during the season?
He becomes like he's a different person on Tuesday night versus a pay-per-view night. Now I interact with him a lot less on pay-per-view nights, but I've interacted with him enough to know like pay-per-view night, he's all business, right? Like this is the core of his business. He's worried about numbers. He's making sure that the production is doing what it needs to. It's connecting with ESPN. Like it's a business. Tuesday night, he's a fan. Tuesday night is like, you can see that part of him that fell in love with the idea of the sport when someone first broached him with this crazy idea of this company that was failing and let's buy it for $2 million. Like you can see that part of him that just enjoyed watching Tuesday night boxing, which is why he wanted Contender Series to be on a Tuesday. It really just speaks to kind of like the part of him that just loves fighting and loves fighters. And that's why on that show, you earn a contract sometimes for reasons other than you would win a fight in the UFC. And the more that people understand that, and I think they're getting it, especially after the BJ Piper speech, the more that people understand that, the more successful they are on that show.
It's absolutely amazing. And you talked about the difference in obviously pay-per-views and Tuesday nights. You obviously great moment for the sport, great moment for broadcasting, getting on the pay-per-view call this year.
Yeah.
Can you take me back to that moment, like the lead up for it? I know you're like not going to be on Contender Series this week, kind of busy.
Yeah.
And obviously, I know the world was elated for you. I know like a mutual friend, someone I've worked with in the past, Luke Thomas, was super happy for you. So many people in this world were so happy for you. Can you kind of take me into that week and the build up and all of that?
Yeah, it was really cool. I got the news actually literally in this chair, the same computer setup, because I was in the middle of fighter meetings I want to say it was like in July. Because I think, it was the fights I was calling in July. And then I got a call from my boss who knew I was in fighter meetings. So that's why I was confused. But I picked up and I was like, "Hey, I'm in fighter meetings. Can I call you back?" He's like, "No, this is real quick. Do you want to do the pay-per-view in September?" And I was like, "Yeah, I do." He's like, "Okay, cool. You're on it." So what's funny about it is like obviously I'm not the A team for pay-per-views. That's Joe and DC and Mike's done a lot, and Paul's done a lot, and Dom's done a lot. To be honest with you, it was an assignment that I wasn't really asking for yet because I didn't feel like I had necessarily put in my work or earned those stripes, so to speak, quite yet. So it was a huge surprise. But it wasn't like a last minute thing like a lot of people kind of maybe thought, because I just didn't say anything about it because so much can change. I didn't want to run out and like make some big announcement and then you just never know with this crazy business. But that week was crazy. It was wild. It was really this is really surreal to know that like the thing that you've really been centering your life and your goals around for so long is just tick, 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 getting closer and closer and closer. And you try not to make too big of a deal out of it because you don't want to psych yourself out and overthink it. Like I've called fights a million times at this point, it's really not that different, but it is different. It's totally different. And I wasn't nervous about my ability to do the job. I knew that would be, obviously I was fine with that, but I was nervous about, this is going to sound so stupid, but I just really wanted people to like me. Like, I really wanted the fans to like me because, or I should say, not like me as a person, but I like how I did. Because I'm a fan and I wouldn't want my pay-per-view to be ruined by someone that I thought sucked, So it was, and I guess at the end of the day, I didn't feel like I had 100% control over that. Like I could do my best, and I knew that there might still be a percentage of our fan base that was like, "Oh, I don't like it," And I didn't know how big that percentage was going to be, I guess is what it comes down to. I didn't know if it'd be 10. I didn't know if it'd be 70. And that was really what was giving me the like, nerves that I had a little bit of, but not too bad really. And it went well. And I was
It
really
went very well.
thanks.
To that point, do you realize how big of a fan club you have and like how motivational you are to especially like women in MMA and combat sports and all? Because you go on Twitter or now X, and it's just not only are there Laura Sanko stands, but there are so many women that talk about you're the reason they're trying to get into the sport. You're the reason they want to call fights and do fighter interviews. Like, I know you're saying like I just want, hopefully more people enjoy my calls and not enjoy my calls, but you're every single fight you call, you're kind of motivating up the next generation.
I appreciate that. I'm not prepared to sit here and, think of myself as a motivation, although I'm seeing more and more of those comments. I'm getting more of those comments. I'm having, a lot of women, a lot of ex-fighters or current fighters even approach me for advice about how to transition into the media side of things. And I love that. I love that so much. It's not every time it happens, I'm like, me? Really, me? But it's amazing. And yeah, I'm glad you say that. I appreciate that. I've been spending less time on social media over the last year just because it's a double-edged sword, right? And I would love to sit here and tell you that like the negative stuff doesn't affect me, but the truth is that it does more than it should, and I'm working on that. And some days it doesn't bug me at all, and some days it really does for some reason. So I've kind of just like created some boundaries for myself, I guess you could say. But what I really appreciate is like when someone will point out, be like, hey, you should go look at so-and-so's tweet, or you should go look at Luke Thomas's video and see what he said about you. And those moments that's crazy to me. Like, I listened to Luke for years, just because I love his content. And I think he's one of the smartest minds in this entire game. And I love the fact that like he was a big inspiration, to be honest with you, because he's so intelligent. He really dives into a level of detail in his analysis that not many people do, particularly not ex-fighters. And so when I saw how much respect he had in the industry, even though he didn't fight in the UFC, I was like, okay, maybe there's a chance that I, who never fought in the UFC, and who has a laughably short professional career, might be able to, over time, with the right amount of work and the right amount of consistently showing up with good information, I might be able to get, some modicum of that level of respect as well. So he was a big inspiration for me, for sure.
As someone who worked as an associate producer for him at Sirius XM, I thought I like loved and was obsessed with the sport. And then I worked with Luke for like a week, and I was like, I don't know jack shit. I was like, I can't, like, what? Like the way he just breaks everything down. And it was such a great learning time for me to work with him. UFC 295, that's what we're really here for. I really just kind of want to touch on the top three big fights, and then see if there's any that stand out to you, whether it be on the prelims or also on the main card. And I'll just start with the main event. Obviously, huge news leading up to it just a couple of weeks ago. John Jones going to be out for 8 months. Torn pecs a week. Or I'm sorry, that's a co-main event. We got Yuri Prohaska and Alex Pereira for the light heavyweight title. I mean, Alex Pereira, what can you say about him, right? Glory Hall of Fame, now former middleweight champion, going up to 205, but Yuri Prohaska, both guys really, and especially Yuri, I mean, power, just relentless in their attacks. And I think as much as I like the new co-main event heavyweight title, I think this was the fight to make for the main event. How do you see this fight playing out?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one. These two guys are the embodiment of old school martial arts warriors, right? Like you could imagine them living in another time in history. And one is I don't even know what the warriors from the Czech Republic long ago would be called. I'm not gonna pretend like I do, but one's a samurai and one is, you get my point. Like you could see their old school mentality that's rooted in respect for the art and rooted in ultimate respect for the opponent as well. These guys aren't going to be out there trash talking each other. They're going to talk about their own abilities and their ability to win against their opponent, but it's going to be a different type of fight than we often see. And in terms of their skills, this is a really, really fun fight. I like Alex Pereira up at 205 a lot more than at 185. Even though we saw him do amazing things, I think at 205, he's going to be able to open up a whole new level to his game, which is crazy to think about, given how much he doesn't have to focus on cutting weight, during a camp. That weight cut for him was insane. I don't know if you ever saw the picture of him next to Dominic Reyes, but
Yeah.
like he made Dominic Reyes look tiny. And you're thinking to yourself, this guy fights 20 pounds less than Dominic Reyes. So at the fact that he's up, I love that. I thought he proved a lot in the fight against Jan Blachowicz. I thought, even though it wasn't the most dominant win, wasn't a knockout, the fact that he was able to hang with a former champion of the division, defend his grappling, and then land the more effective striking says a lot about how well-rounded his skill set really is. We may not see him offensively grapple ever, maybe, but the defensive grappling, I mean, that box got checked in that Jan Blachowicz fight. And then for Yuri Prochazka, I mean, a year and a half away, dealing with the shoulder injury, but this is a guy, I don't know how you train for Yuri Prochazka, to be honest with you, because I don't think he goes into a fight with much of a game plan. Everything he does is just sort of poured out of him in violent creativity. So it's a type of fight that's really difficult to prepare for. They're both strikers, but they're very different types of strikers. And I can't wait to see how those skills kind of end up colliding in this fight.
Two side stories from me. Just get your quick thoughts on them. Yuri coming off the shoulder injury, which Dana White said was one of the worst injuries he's ever seen, especially in the shoulder. Obviously, you always have long-term concern about how will he return to form better than before. And then for Alex Pereira, this is just me and the other element of fighting that I love. You got a guy who, yes, he won the middleweight title, but his mentor, Glover Teixeira, having held this belt before and being able to bring it home. Those two storylines for each of them separately, how do you think those kind of play a part come on fight night?
Well, I think that you're right. I think you nailed it on the head. I think that this fight has extra meaning for Alex, especially because of Glover losing to Yuri, especially in the way that Glover lost to Yuri. And just sort of it was just a bad fight IQ moment, to be honest with you. That last round, he made a couple of bad decisions that changed the fight. He was going to win the fight if that last round didn't play out the way that it did. Of course, credit to Yuri, for the way that it did go down. But I think Alex is on a little bit of a martial arts mission here to vindicate his mentor. I think that really is going to mean a lot to him. And Glover's going to be able to, give him some of the nuances of Yuri's game, which is important when you're fighting a guy who is as unpredictable as Yuri, who is really only has 3 fights in the UFC. There's plenty of tape on him, but not a lot of UFC context. So to have someone who spent that much time with him in an octagon and in recent history where Glover can say where he was strong, it's hard to pick up on tendencies in Yuri's film, but if anybody can do it, it's going to be the man who spent a lot of time in the octagon with him. And then for Yuri, in terms of the shoulder injury, I am anxious to see how he comes back from that. I think if anybody who can come back from a devastating injury like that, it's someone with the mentality of Yuri Prochazka, because I think sometimes when guys get in trouble, it's when they are more athletes and competitors. It's the competitors who get themselves in trouble when they have injuries because they just so desperately want to get back to competition. But when you've got a guy who has that martial arts mindset, like we talked about a moment ago, I think those are the guys who are not afraid to go slowly, who are not afraid to give the respect to the sport, and the respect to their body, and just sort of have that mentality of like, I know that this belt will come to me when it's meant to come to me. And I'm going to take every step necessary to make sure that I'm ready when it does. So I think the fact that Yuri is the type of guy that he is really speaks to what we should expect to see from him, which is he's 100%.
I can't wait for it. And I also can't wait for the interim heavyweight title fight co-main event. For my money, and I don't want to piss off John or Stipe because Lord knows they can both eat me. But for my money, Sergey and Tom are the two current active best heavyweights on the roster.
100%.
And this is the best fight. This is the best case scenario for the worst case scenario of losing John on Stipe on 2 weeks notice. With that being said, this is 2 weeks notice. What are you expecting from both guys? They both got the same amount of time. They both got the same amount of notice, but they both also have the same reward waiting for them. And that's not only the interim title, but that's a chance at John or Stipe or to become just the undisputed heavyweight champion.
Yeah. Well, first off, I'm definitely devastated that we're not getting this John Jones Stipe fight. But I am kind of like, I guess, happy to know that that fight's going to happen regardless. And I think everybody knows that regardless, you know, a year from now, 2 years from now, even if these guys are not at their peak anymore, we're going to get that fight and we're going to have that closure between the two of them. But to your point, you know, John is still very much an unknown entity at heavyweight. We saw a glimpse of how great he could be, and it was pretty dang good. But we don't really know how he fights at heavyweight. So there's a lot of question marks there. Where there's not question marks is Sergey Pavlovich and Tom Aspinall. And these are two of the most known entities in the heavyweight division. It's an interesting conversation to have after last weekend in Sao Paulo, because I think Jailton Almeida was being put in that conversation a lot. I'm not saying that he can't be or doesn't deserve to be top 5. I do think his skill set's there. Having watched that last fight, though, I don't think he's ready to be champion. And I think that even he would sit back and recognize that there's a little bit of work to be done there. So now we're down to 2, and we get to see those 2 guys fight. And honestly, like, that doesn't always happen in the UFC, where the best versus the best, especially in lieu of not getting the John and Stipe fight. These two have incredible skill sets. I mean, Tom Aspinall, it's really rare at heavyweight that you get someone as well-rounded as he is and as athletic. And it drives me crazy how often we trot out the phrase, he doesn't move like a heavyweight. We use that all the time to describe any heavyweight that's not just like barely moving. And we need to quit doing that. And I'm talking about myself here because I do it too. Tom Aspinall is about the only guy in this division that you can really say that about, especially over the length of a fight. Even though we haven't seen him go past 2 rounds, this is a guy who has a level of athleticism that is truly, I'm going to say it's one of one in terms of his movement. I'll say that. Power, I think Pavlovich has the edge, but the movement of Tom Aspinall, I don't know that I've ever seen anything like it before at heavyweight. On the flip side of it, Sergey Pavlovich, I honestly think that he might have more power than Derek Lewis does. And the reason I say that is because this is a guy who, I think it's like he knows how to use it more effectively, maybe. And if he ends up having as many fights as Derek Lewis does in the UFC, which I don't remember how many Derek has, but it is a lot, I could see him potentially breaking Derek's record. Because when Sergey touches people, what's crazy is even when these big guys, these well-muscled guys with big shoulders and big arms get their guard up, even when he's hitting them through their guard, it's enough to give them, you know, to rock them. And then he's able to follow it up and put guys away consistently in the first round. We've never seen a guy with a 6-fight first round knockout streak in the history of this UFC. It's crazy. It's crazy.
It is. And like we both said it, the stakes are very high and I can't wait. You know, I think both of them getting 2 weeks notice and having the interim title, there's just so much to look forward to in that one. Two quick last ones here as I wrap up with you. And I thank you so much for all of your time. Jessica Andrade, Mackenzie Dern. This is really a moment for Mackenzie to really shine. Do you think she can make the most of this opportunity?
I think she can, but she needs to be really cognizant and not allow, you know, the red of the Tapology page of Jessica Andrade to lull her into thinking that she could go toe to toe with her. Because, you know, we've seen in history where you can fall in love with aspects of your game that are not really the bread and butter of your game. Ronda comes to mind, right? Like if Ronda would have just kept armbarring people, I think she'd still be doing it, to be honest with you. It's important to round out your skill set, of course, but do what brought you to the dance, particularly in women's MMA, which is for a fact, in terms of technique and athleticism, is, I would say, still 10 years behind men's MMA, where you can have these specialists who can be very successful and stay successful for long periods of time. That's starting to change, but it's still the case if you are enough of a specialist. And for Mackenzie Dern, you don't get much more of a specialist in terms of jiu-jitsu than you will ever find in Mackenzie. So I guess my point is, if she can go out there and fight a smart fight and find a way to get Jessica Andrade to the ground, that's going to be the tricky part, because Mackenzie's striking has improved, but it's still a little bit green at times. Her wrestling is not great, but of course she's an ace once she gets it to the ground. And on the flip side, Jessica Andrade doesn't always have like the cleanest technique, but man, I have never seen a woman throw bombs like that. Like, she's one of the most devastating strikers, regardless of weight class. She's fought in almost every single one of them. She's a legend. And so you have to approach a legend with the appropriate amount of respect, regardless of whether she's been on a skid or not. So that's a great fight. It's really important for Jessica to get back on track, prove that she still has it. She's got to find a division where she really settles in, is able to do some work. I think strawweight could be that division. And Mackenzie, this is really a moment to get a big scalp for sure.
My last one, and I really do appreciate your time. Any fight or fighter that you're looking forward to that we haven't mentioned? I know for me, Pat Sabatini's always extremely fun to watch.
Oh yeah.
On a personal level, Jared Gordon. I'm waiting for the Patty Pimblett hangover to get back into Jared's. I don't know how you feel. I think a lot of the world knows who won that fight. So I like to see him get back in there and kind of, reset himself in the division. Any fighter you're looking forward to the most?
I mean, you named a couple really good ones there. The Pat Sabatini, Diego Lopez fight, should be phenomenal. Both of those guys are really, really fun to watch on the ground. But I mean, let's be honest, Matt Frevola versus Santini is going to be stupid fun. That fight is going to be so good. You hate like potentially cursing certain matchups and saying there's no way that fight's not good, but there's just no way that fight's not any good. Those two guys, they can bang, they can wrestle, but mostly they can bang. And I cannot wait to watch them try to take each other out.
I can't wait to watch your coverage all this week for UFC 295. Laura Sanko, amazing year for you, amazing career so far for you. I hope it's not another 3-year kind of stretch that we go.
No, let's not do that.
But no, you're, everything I said. And I just, as we started it, I want to end it on this. I was not brown nosing. I was just giving credit where credit was due. I stopped tweeting into the weigh-in show after that.
Keep it up. We need more of that.
Well, the thing is, every time I do it, then I'll have Dean on the show, and then Dean and I will talk about it, and I'll get called out twice, and it's just it's fun. No, but you are truly, not just to myself, but to so many, as I said earlier, inspiring and motivating. And it's no secret, sometimes this podcast goes through a dry spell because sometimes it's hard to wake up and talk about fights or get interviews and all that. But seeing someone like you keeps my foot on the gas pedal. So can't wait for your coverage and all that you do this week. Enjoy the fights, and hopefully we'll talk sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate it. And keep at it, man. I mean, it's hard work for all of us, but you're doing a great job. And I appreciate you having me on. You're always well prepared. And like, you know your stuff, as good as anybody out there. So I have no doubt that if you just stick with it, this will continue to be a success and just grow from here. So don't give up.
Thank you very much. Yeah. We'll talk soon.
All right. Thanks, Mike.